The Public Safety and Transportation Committee also asked Police Chief John Carmichael to explain the process on how gun licenses are distributed for residents to carry and/or conceal and for gun shops to open.
Here in Massachusetts, Mass General Law Chapter 140 is the law that identifies what the licensing requirements are for somebody to have a license to carry firearms, i.e. Pistols, rifles, shotguns, as well as firearms identification cards or FID card. And there's very specific guidelines that are in the law here in Massachusetts. They designate the local police chief of each city and town as being the licensing authority for licensed to carry firearms, or the colonel of the state police. And so there's various types of licenses. There are your Class A licenses, which is basically unrestricted carrying of firearms. There's other classes such as hunting and target, and the FID card is a license where that would basically be for rifles and shotguns, where somebody would not obviously be carrying on their person in any way. Chapter 269 is the Mass General laws that cover all gun crimes. So there's a lot of gun crimes in Mass General law as well. Specifically, I guess, related to the conversation tonight is Massachusetts General Law Chapter 269, Section 10 prohibits carrying firearms on school property, which includes elementary schools, high schools, colleges, universities, with the exemption being police officers. So being the licensing authority in my time so far as a chief, I've been involved in the licensing process for these types of licenses for years now. There's under Mass General Law, there's 2 times that a person could be deemed a prohibited person, which means they cannot be licensed under Massachusetts General Law. And there's one side which is prohibited persons, where if a person has committed a felony, a misdemeanor where the imprisonment might be over 2 years, anybody who's committed a violent crime, anyone that's carried a weapon or ammunition and has been charged with that, or any violations of our controlled substances laws, or persons who may or have been addicted to alcohol or drugs, or people who also have been committed under Department of Mental Health. There are other times when a person may be identified as a prohibited person as well, and that's the other side of the statute, which talks about suitability. And a police chief, as they take all of the factors into consideration, if there are factors in there that might suggest that the person, either in the past or even existing factors where that person is or could be a risk to public safety, the chief can make a determination that that person is unsuitable to have a license to carry or FID card. And so the person would have a right to appeal and everything if they were denied. But anytime that the chief makes or his designee makes a conclusion that this person might be a risk to public safety, then they could deny that person for that license.
Was to understand the permitting of stores that might sell firearms.
Walpole, we did have several locations that sold guns, one of them being Walmart, which is a very large chain store that does have licenses to sell firearms. That would probably be the biggest one that I've dealt with. But certainly anytime an establishment wants to put in a gun shop, there's certainly ability to restrict it, to restrict the hours, restrict the zoning, where and if there's particular areas in the city you would like to put it. They have to be licensed, and the licensing is basically done the same way through the chief of police. So they get a certain license that allows them to sell firearms. One of the big issues in Massachusetts is you cannot sell firearms from your own home. So you have to have, if you're a dealer, you would have to have a location, brick and mortar location where you could run that business out of. So in Massachusetts, there's a limit on how many firearms an individual could sell. So there's already some restrictions in there in the law as far as that's concerned.
If I could add to that, Chief, the process basically starts with a business applying to the federal government, the ATF, for a federal firearms license dealer. Once that's done, then they apply to the city or the town to get the chief's approval for that. We do the same exact background checks on federal firearms licenses. The addition to that is the federal government also does background investigations on those who apply for an FFL. I've been involved in two of these firearms license dealers who wanted to come into Newton or propose a business. The more recent one on Washington Street, and we had one several years ago in the Upper Falls. And the one in the Upper Falls already had an FFL license. They were ready to go. We, as the Newton Police Department, go and inspect these premises. We make sure, as the chief said, they have proper security, they have cameras, their firearms are locked up. We go through a checklist provided by the state or through the state that dictates how records are checked, how firearms are logged in, how firearms are logged out when they're sold, how the books have to match up to all sales, et cetera. And the one that we did a few years ago in the Upper Falls actually failed an inspection. I reviewed the place. We went and looked to where this FFL was going to store his firearms, and it didn't meet our specifications and our requirements. So we denied that person. So we do in Newton do a pretty thorough background check, and we also go check the premise and make sure it's acceptable and secure. Again, the last thing we want is for somebody to break in, steal firearms, and now we don't know where they are. So we've definitely done our due diligence in the past, and under Chief Carmichael, we'll do the same. I can also add, we're also required once a year to do an inspection on these premises to make sure that the books do match. And Kevin Rudd is here as well. He's the sergeant who's currently in charge of it. I was in charge of firearms a few years ago. So we do also do those inspections annually, and we could also do pop inspections. If we think a firearms dealer is maybe not following all the rules, we have every right to go and inspect their logbooks at any time.
We do the background check. We basically do all the work, and then we submit the applications to the state. They basically cross-reference and they check everything that we submit, and then they issue the license. So the license actually comes from the state of Massachusetts to the card holder. We don't actually issue the license. It comes back through here, but the license comes from the state. So it's a statewide license to carry once that's issued. So this is a situation where we have seen people that may submit a license to carry application, and they may have had multiple situations where they were charged with violent crimes, but they were not convicted. And so that's when the second prong of the licensing comes into play, the suitability issue, and denying that person based on the fact that all these other incidents and taking that kind of everything into consideration and denying them on suitability.
If I could add to that briefly, a restraining order is also a thing that will trigger a suspension or a revocation, and also a denial of a license to carry.
Once the license is approved, we also check subsequent activity through the Firearms Record Bureau. So if there is somebody that is charged with a crime or the restraining order, we get notice of that, and we check to see whether or not a license needs to be suspended at that time.
I've heard this, and I don't know if there's a difference here in Massachusetts, but license to carry and license to conceal, is that the same thing, or is those, are we talking about the two different things here?
Yeah, so this issue actually came up recently in the city of Newton with an incident that we responded to. The Massachusetts law is silent on whether or not an individual can open carry or carry the firearm concealed. So typically what happens if somebody is carrying a firearm with open carry, in other words, people can see it, other than a police officer, I think we would get a call on that. Somebody's going to call. And the way that we have to respond to those types of situations is that a police officer can always ask for somebody's license to carry. They can demand it, and the person is required to produce that license to carry. So that's usually how we would handle something like that. There's really no violation unless, you know, it's causing some type of an alarm or there's some other type of behavior that's going along with that that could cause us to take further action with that.
If I could add to that, Chief, every application that comes in for a license to carry has to have an interview. So I did that for 3 years. Sergeant Rudd has done this for a couple of years now. Every applicant who comes in, we inform them of that it's not specific whether they have to carry it concealed or unconcealed. However, we always remind them, if chances are very, very, very good, if you're walking through Newton and you have an unconcealed firearm, you will likely be stopped by a Newton police officer or called about. So we definitely give them that warning when they come in and ask for a license.
Are license to carry, are they good indefinitely, lifetime unless revoked, or is there any type of renewal process like driver's licenses?
No, they have to renew them every 6 years, and they go back through the same process as to when they originally applied. So prior to that license expiring, people will come in and they will fill out a new application, and we basically run them through the same process as they originally went through in order to relicense them.